The Haunted House on Elder Hill. Grandma's Tale. It was a damp autumn evening, the fog hanging heavy in the air. The smell of burning wood filled the small village nestled at the foot of Elder Hill. The children, all huddled in their woolen sweaters, sat around the fire as the embers flickered and danced in the hearth. Grandma Marigold, her silver hair wrapped in a bun and her glasses perched precariously on her nose, leaned forward in her rocking chair. Her gnarled hands, shaking slightly from age, picked up the worn book that sat on the table beside her. But instead of opening it, she set it down again and looked at the children, her sharp eyes twinkling with mischief, or perhaps something darker. "Do you know about the Blackwood Manor on Elder Hill?" she asked, her voice low and gravelly. The room seemed to grow colder as she spoke, though none of the children dared to move. The youngest, Thomas, a boy of no more than 8, squirmed in his seat. "Is that the haunted house, Grandma?" Grandma Marigold's lips curled into a small, knowing smile. "Ah, haunted is one way to describe it, yes. But that's only part of the story." The children leaned in closer, as if by doing so, they might learn the secret that had been whispered among the village for generations. Even the air seemed to hold its breath. "You see, many years ago, the Blackwood family came to live on Elder Hill. They weren't like any other family. They were rich, wealthy beyond belief. But with wealth came greed, and greed has a way of twisting the heart," she began, her voice dropping to a murmur. "It was Mr. Edgar Blackwood, the father, who first heard the voices. He thought it was the wind at first, or perhaps his imagination. But as the days went on, he began to hear them more clearly, and they spoke to him, not softly, not sweetly, but in a way that made his skin crawl." Thomas clutched his blanket tightly. His older sister, Eliza, rolled her eyes, but even she was intrigued. "What did the voices say, Grandma?" Grandma's eyes glinted with something almost mischievous, almost sinister. "Oh, they promised him things. Power, immortality, wealth beyond what he could ever dream. But there was a price he was willing to pay." The fire crackled as if it, too, was listening. Mr. Blackwood thought it was a bargain. The voices came from the very walls of Blackwood Manor itself. You see, the house was alive, not in the way we are, but in a dark, twisted way. And it hungered, Grandma said, leaning in closer to the children, her voice growing even quieter. It fed on human desires. The more you wanted, the more it could take from you. The room grew silent as the children imagined the house, standing tall and forbidding on the hill. But Grandma's voice continued, low and insistent. Edgar Blackwood made a pact with the house. He promised to feed it his soul in exchange for eternal life. He told his wife, Eleanor, and his 2 children, Margaret and Henry, that it was all for their benefit, for the family's future. Grandma paused, her eyes narrowing. But there's always a catch, always a trick. The house took Edgar's soul, but it wasn't satisfied. It wanted more. It wanted all of them. Thomas gasped. Eliza, a little older and braver, shook her head. That's just a story, right? Grandma Marigold fixed her with a piercing stare. Do you think I would tell you a story that's just for fun? You know I don't tell lies. Eliza's bravado faltered, and she looked away, her fingers twitching nervously at the edges of her sweater. The house didn't stop with Edgar, Grandma continued. No, it turned its sights on the rest of the family. Eleanor, who had heard the strange whispers but never believed them, started to change. She became pale, her eyes sunken. She grew weaker each day until she disappeared altogether. The fire crackled, casting shadows that seemed to flicker strangely, as if moving of their own accord. Margaret and Henry weren't immune. They began hearing the voices too. At first, they thought it was just their father's madness, but the voices knew them. They knew their deepest fears, their darkest desires. The house fed on their fears, growing stronger, darker, until they couldn't escape it. Grandma's voice grew quieter still, and the children leaned forward, their faces pale in the flickering firelight. And one by one, they disappeared. No one ever saw them again. The house, Blackwood Manor, was empty, but it wasn't silent. "What happened to the house?" asked Eliza, her voice barely above a whisper. Grandma's smile faded, and her eyes turned dark. "It became a prison for those who sought to leave but couldn't. The house still calls to those who are curious, to those who wander too close. It whispers in the wind, just as it whispered to Edgar Blackwood." There was a long silence, broken only by the distant howl of wind outside. "Grandma," Thomas started, his voice quivering. "Do you think it will call to us?" Grandma's gaze softened. "It's already calling, child. The house never forgets, and it always waits,